In this video, I will be summarizing Rothbard's Anatomy of the State, in which he explains what the state is, what the state is not, and how the state behaves. For those who do not know, Murray Rothbard is one of the leading figures in the Austrian School of Economics and Anarcho-Capitalism. He has done a lot of work to intellectually dismantle myths regarding the state, such as governments being an extension of their people, and governments being the only institutions that should provide law, security, and infrastructure. In this article, Rothbard provides a detailed description of how he sees the state as an illegitimate institution. Chapter 1. What the state is not. Rothbard challenges the widespread belief that the state is an institution of social service. He critiques the idea that the state represents society or acts in the interest of the collective good. This misconception is amplified by democratic ideologies that equate the state with the people, leading to absurd claims like, "We are the government." This logic, Rothbard argues, obscures the coercive nature of the state. For example, he points out that if we are the government, then any harm inflicted by the state, such as taxation, imprisonment, or conscription, would absurdly be considered voluntary acts by individuals against themselves. This reasoning leads to further distortions, such as the claim that Jews under Nazi rule committed suicide, since they were part of a democratically chosen government. Rothbard forcefully rejects these fallacies, emphasizing that the government is a distinct and coercive entity, not an extension of the populace. To Rothbard, the state is fundamentally different from voluntary organizations or social institutions. Unlike private entities that generate income through the production of goods and services, the state acquires its revenue through force, primarily taxation. This coercive extraction is enforced through the threat of imprisonment or violence. Moreover, once it secures its revenue, the state extends its control by regulating and dictating the actions of individuals. Rothbard concludes that the state's power and wealth are built on coercion and compulsion, not mutual agreement or benefit. Chapter 2. What the state is. Rothbard contrasts the natural and voluntary means by which humans acquire wealth with the coercive methods employed by the state. He explains that humans, born into the world with nothing, must transform natural resources using their labor and ingenuity to create wealth. This process of production and exchange enables individuals to improve their standard of living through peaceful cooperation and mutual benefit. The free market, based on property rights and voluntary exchange, allows for the efficient allocation of resources and the multiplication of wealth, avoiding conflicts over scarcity. Drawing on the work of German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer, Rothbard introduces the distinction between the economic means and the political means of acquiring wealth. The economic means refers to production and voluntary exchange, while the political means involves the seizure of wealth through force or coercion. Rothbard argues that the state epitomizes the political means, acting as an organized system of predation over a given territory. Unlike sporadic acts of crime, the state institutionalizes this predatory process, providing a legal and systematic framework for the expropriation of private property. Using historical examples, Rothbard illustrates how states are born out of conquest and exploitation. For instance, a conquering tribe might realize that allowing a conquered population to live and produce while exacting regular tribute would be more beneficial than outright looting. Over time, such arrangements evolve into the formalized structures of states. Rothbard also uses the hypothetical example of a bandit chieftain in South Ruritania, declaring himself king to show how force and prolonged dominance transform criminal gangs into recognized governments. This institutionalization of coercion enables the state to maintain a relatively peaceful and secure parasitic relationship with its subjects, ensuring its survival and perpetuation. Chapter 3. How the state preserves itself. Rothbard examines how the state sustains its authority over time. While coercion is a primary tool, the state's long-term survival hinges on gaining the ideological support of its citizens. Without a majority's acceptance, whether active enthusiasm or passive resignation, the ruling minority would face eventual resistance from the majority. Since the state relies on extracting resources from producers, it remains a minority entity and must ensure the public's compliance through ideological means. To maintain support, the state creates vested economic interests by distributing privileges and subsidies to specific groups, such as bureaucrats, nobility, or corporations. However, this strategy only secures the allegiance of a minority. For broader acceptance, the state enlists intellectuals to craft and disseminate ideologies that portray the government as just, necessary, and inevitable. These intellectuals, including historians, economists, and religious figures, benefit from their alliance with the state, gaining prestige and secure positions in exchange for their loyalty. Rothbard provides examples of this alliance throughout history, such as 19th-century German professors serving as the intellectual bodyguard of the Hohenzollern monarchy and modern scholars who rationalize state policies under the guise of science. The union of church and state exemplifies an early and successful ideological tool, where rulers were often portrayed as divine or chosen by God, making resistance tantamount to blasphemy. Similarly, the state exploits nationalism by equating attacks on rulers with attacks on the people, converting wars between governments into wars between populations. Tradition and fear are other potent ideological weapons. By emphasizing historical continuity, the state gains legitimacy through the weight of its long-standing rule. Fear, on the other hand, is used to depict alternatives to state authority as chaotic or dangerous, convincing citizens that even an imperfect government is preferable to the perceived horrors of anarchy or foreign conquest. Additionally, the state employs guilt to dissuade dissent, labeling private wealth and individualism as selfish or greedy, while presenting its predatory actions as noble and altruistic. Rothbard also critiques the use of scientific jargon and complex theories to justify state policies. For instance, Keynesian economics' multiplier effect masks the coercive nature of taxation and government spending, making actions that would otherwise be seen as theft appear beneficial. In these ways, the state continually seeks to cloak its coercion in a veneer of legitimacy, ensuring that its rule is seen as indispensable and beyond question. Chapter 4. How the State Transcends Its Limits. In this chapter, Rothbard points out the state's ability to transform concepts intended to limit its power into tools for legitimizing its authority. He draws on Bertrand de Jouvenel's observation that historical checks on power, like divine sovereignty and parliamentary democracy, have been co-opted to reinforce the state's dominance. Similarly, doctrines such as natural rights and constitutional restrictions have been reshaped to justify government actions, often to the detriment of individual liberty. Rothbard examines the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, highlighting how judicial review, rather than limiting the state, has evolved into a mechanism for legitimizing its expanding powers. Charles Black's analysis shows that legitimacy is essential for a government's survival, and judicial review provides this legitimacy by interpreting constitutional limits in a way that accommodates increasing government control. However, this process effectively places the state as the judge of its own power, undermining true accountability. John C. Calhoun's theory of the concurrent majority is presented as an attempt to address this flaw by giving significant minorities, such as states, the ability to veto unconstitutional federal actions. While this concept offers stronger checks, it risks enabling state-level oppression or collusion between federal and state authorities against citizens. Rothbard extends this idea to propose that ultimate veto power should reside with individuals, granting them the right to nullify unjust authority or even secede from the state. Finally, Rothbard asserts that the state inherently seeks to expand its power through coercion and confiscation, positioning itself against private individuals and capitalism. He concludes that the state's nature is fundamentally antithetical to liberty and private enterprise, driven by a perpetual hunger for authority and resources. Chapter 5. What the State Fears. According to Rothbard, the state's greatest fear is the loss of its power and legitimacy. The state faces two primary existential threats: conquest by another state or revolutionary overthrow by its own subjects. These threats, war and revolution, elicit the state's maximum efforts to preserve itself. In times of war, the state appeals to its citizens by equating its survival with their own, even using conscription to force individuals into defending what the state claims to be their interests. Rothbard highlights the absurdity of this logic, as individuals are coerced into serving a state that claims to protect their freedom. War, Rothbard argues, serves as a tool for the state to expand its power. Under the pretext of defense and emergency, the state imposes levels of control and tyranny that would face resistance during peacetime. Every modern war leaves a legacy of increased state burdens on society, as well as opportunities for the state to conquer new territories and extend its monopoly on force. Randolph Bourne's famous phrase, "War is the health of the state," captures this dynamic, though for any individual state, war may also result in its downfall. Rothbard also examines the state's priorities when enforcing laws, which reveal its primary concern for self-preservation rather than the welfare of its citizens. Crimes such as treason, tax evasion, or draft evasion are pursued with far greater zeal than crimes against private individuals. For instance, the state devotes immense resources to punishing counterfeiting of its currency while showing comparatively less interest in private assaults or theft. This prioritization underscores that the state's actions are fundamentally about protecting itself rather than society at large. Rothbard concludes that the state's primary goal is to maintain its own power and existence. This self-preservation often comes at the expense of the very people it claims to protect, demonstrating the stark difference between the state's interests and those of its subjects. Chapter 6. How States Relate to One Another. This chapter examines the interactions between different states. Rothbard argues that states are inherently competitive and often engage in wars, imperialism, and territorial expansion to increase their power and resources. Alliances and treaties are formed not out of goodwill or mutual respect, but to serve the strategic interests of ruling elites. For example, Rothbard critiques alliances like NATO as tools for expanding state power under the guise of collective security. He also discusses how international relations are marked by a constant struggle for dominance, with little regard for the well-being of ordinary people. Wars, he argues, are often waged not for defense but for the economic and political interests of those in power. Chapter 7. History as a Race Between State Power and Social Power. Rothbard concludes by framing history as a continuous struggle between state power and social power. Social power represents the voluntary cooperation, innovation, and productivity of individuals and communities. In contrast, state power seeks to control and exploit these efforts for its own benefit. Rothbard argues that human progress depends on the triumph of social power over state power. He calls for vigilance and resistance to state encroachments on liberty and society. For example, he highlights the Industrial Revolution as a period where social power flourished despite state attempts to control and tax emerging industries. By fostering voluntary institutions and reducing reliance on the state, individuals can create a freer and more prosperous world. Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State provides a profound critique of the nature and role of the state in society. He reveals the state as a coercive monopoly that prioritizes its own survival over the well-being of its citizens. Through taxation, propaganda, and control of education, the state ensures its legitimacy and dominance while suppressing dissent. Intellectuals and media often serve as tools to shape public perception, presenting the state as indispensable and benevolent. However, history demonstrates that progress depends on resisting state power and fostering voluntary cooperation, innovation, and community-driven solutions. By understanding and challenging the exploitative nature of the state, individuals can work towards a society where liberty and social power prevail over coercion and control.